Hello, in this video we're going to work through one of the exam review questions, and what we're going to do is we will write a program that takes an integer input, then we will use a for loop to calculate the factorial. And if we don't know what a factorial is defined as follows. 5 factorial, which is written as like this, is 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. 6 factorial would be 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. Then we want to output the factorial to the screen. So our input is a number, for example 5. The kind of straightforward output would be just to output the factorial. The middle level output would be actually output the factorial in both of these forms. And the hardest way to do this would be to output the factorial on the same line. And actually this wouldn't be that much harder, but it's a change which will illustrate some nice ideas. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a scanner object. We're going to need an integer called n, and let's take our input. So now the question is, how do I actually calculate this? So the first thing I recognize is that if I'm actually calculating the factorial, which is an integer, I'm going to need another variable to store that. And usually we just initialize our variables to 0 or any value, but this is one case where it actually matters what we initialize this to. We're going to initialize factorial to 1, and we'll see why in a second. So now the question comes, well, how do I set up my loop? I've told you that I want you to use a for loop, but imagine you weren't told to use a for loop here. What would be the clue to use a for loop in this case? So remember, there are two broad categories of loops. There are counted loops and conditional loops. A counted loop, or a for loop, is used when we know how many times that loop needs to execute before entering it. A conditional loop, which is a while and a do-while loop, are used when we don't know how many times the loop needs to execute before entering it. Remember, this is just a general guideline. Loops are completely interchangeable. But if we kind of use this, if we apply this thinking to a problem, we can often pick out the easiest loop to use in a given situation. So if I look at this, if I have to calculate 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, I know how many times this loop has to execute prior to entering it. I need to generate each number from n down to 1. So what I'll do is I'm going to write a loop, and that loop is going to count down from n to 1. So there's two different ways I could do this. I could start at 1 and go up to n, or I could go start at n and go down to 1. So I'm going to start at n. So if we set our count to n, and we want to loop as long as I is greater than 0, and I, each time, we're going to subtract 1. So now, just for the sake of understanding, let's print out n. Let's watch what happens here. If I run this, input n, 5, and we have a little mistake here. We don't want to print out n every time. We want to print out I. There we go. So if we run this now, 5, I get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So let's make sure we understand how this loop works. We come in, our count, I is n, and then let's imagine n is 3. Is 3 greater than 0? Yes. So we print out 3. We get to the bottom of the loop. We apply the change. So I becomes 2. Is 2 greater than 0? Yes. Back to the top. We print out 2. We get to the bottom. We apply the change. I becomes 1. Is 1 greater than 0? Yes. Back to the top. Print out 1. Get to the bottom. I becomes 0. Is 0 greater than 0? No. So it moves on. But I don't want to print out the value of I. I want to multiply it into the factorial. So I can do this using a self-referencing assignment statement. Just like this. So we take whatever currently is in factorial and multiply it by I. So again, if we use the example of 3 for n, so I is 3 greater than 0? True. So factorial times 3 is, and because we've initialized factorial to 1, we get 1 times 3, which is 3. I becomes 2. Is 2 greater than 0? Yes. Back to the top. 3 times 2 is 6. And then we move to the bottom and move to 1. Is 1 greater than 0? Yes. Back to the top. 6 times 1 is 6. Move to the bottom, I becomes 0. It fails, and we move on. And then we just go system.out.println. So if we run this now, and we put in, say, 3 factorial, we get 6. We run this again, and we put in, say, 5 factorial, we get 120. Now, you'll notice something funny with this. If I put in, say, 17 factorial, I get a negative number. The reason for that is because 17 is such a large number. The result of 17 factorial is such a large number, we get something called integer overflow. So it's not valid. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a little logic to our input to ensure that the user inputs a number between 1 and 13. Because I believe this will work up to 13, but 14 it won't. So let's look, 13. And I think if we put in 14, we'll get an obviously wrong number. Oh, maybe not. Nonetheless, let's restrict it to some sort of range here. So since I know I have to ask this once, and the user could put in a bad value as many times as they want, I'm going to use a do while loop. So I'm going to put a do around this, tab that in, while, and I'm going to while as long as n is less than 0 or n is greater than 15. To close the brace. So what this does now is, it sets up a little loop here. It's going to come down and it's going to say, it's going to start with a do, input n, I input a value. And if I put in like 20, is 20 less than 0? That's false. Is 20 greater than 15? That's true, so therefore it loops to the top. So now what I have is I have the situation where I can go 20, 30, 100, negative 13, 11, and there's our factorial. Now, let's finish up this video by looking at how could we set up the output like this. So we could do this by simply using the loop to output these numbers. So what I'm going to do is before I even enter the loop, I'm going to output this component. I'll use the loop to output this, and then I'll use the result after to output the value. So let's take this here, and let's copy this, and let's paste it above. And instead of a print line, I'm going to use a print. And now what I'll do is I'm going to say, we're going to print system.out.print Now we're going to notice something funny here, and we'll talk about what it is in a second. And then all I'm going to print out at the end is the factorial. So watch. If I put in 5, oh, I get n. I don't want that. This needs to be I. There we go. Let's try this again. So I put in 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And notice the problem now is I get this star at the end. So I'm going to need a little bit of logic here. I'm going to say if I is not equal to 1, we're going to print out I and star. Else we're going to print out I equals. Now there's lots of different ways to do this, so it's worth your time trying to explore different techniques. And there we go. 5 factorial is 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 equals 120. And if we wanted to, we could probably get the spacing a little nicer here. And there we go. So I hope this video helped. And of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.